Okay.
Yeah. So I think, why don't you go ahead and just kick it off and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then tell us all about how California is going to save the world.
Well, we hope so. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Craig Siegel, and I'm really pleased to be here. Not often you get to a course that not only seems really sweeping, but also has a good pun right in the title, so it's easy to appreciate it. So I'm Deputy Executive Officer of an organization less euphoniously named CARB, which is the California Air Resources Board. I should say today I'm speaking, for myself, obviously informed by the perspective, but our standard disclaimers. I'm not speaking for my board members who want me to anyway. What CARB is, just to begin there, is by way of background who I am, and then I'll get into the particulars. So CARB is California's climate and air regulator. The story of how it got to be that way is actually relevant to the larger talk, so I'll come to that in a second. But the thing to know up front is it's by far the largest of any state environmental regulators. We're about the same size as US EPA's air branch for the country. It's about 1,800 people, multi-billion-dollar budget. We've been around since the 60s. And we're charged with improving the air quality in California, which has gradually expanded into running what is by far the most comprehensive state climate system and has turned us into among the most ambitious air and climate regulators globally. And we're responsible for things like the catalytic converter on your car, the check engine light on your car, and more recently, very involved in the move to zero emission vehicles overall. I personally oversee about 600-700 people and involved in sort of all the various regulatory efforts we do through my team, as well as an incentive budget of this year, about $3 billion. About $10 billion over the next couple of years, of which about 3/4 of which goes to low-income folks or communities of color as a result of policy choices we've made. So it's a pretty comprehensive set of duties and a fairly interesting set of challenges, because obviously what we're doing at this point, as originally just the state air regulator, is being involved in this really enormous industrial and social transition. And what I thought might be interesting, considering how this course is so focused on state and government power, what can or can't solve problems, and some of the centrifugal or centripetal tensions in our politics these days, is to talk a little bit about how this could have happened and then what we're doing. Because it's an interesting story about historic contingency, about the limits of and the possibilities of agency action. And I think agencies are often not thought about a lot in political theory. We're sort of over there, like the DMV, but in some ways can be more effective or more sweeping than legislatures or executives, and where we're going and some of the challenges this enormous shift away from internal combustion offers. So I think where I'll start is just plain history, which is to say that the moment we're in right now, where it's become possible legally to actually chart out the end of internal combustion sales, at least, and see this global shift where every one of the global automakers has committed to getting away from internal combustion, something that's so profoundly shaped our lives that there's a gas station on seems like every corner, comes out of a series of structural choices and to some degree out of a series of historical peculiarities of coincidences, which I suppose is how things happen. And it really comes out of the very specific truth that the LA basin has high walls. So one way to think about where this starts is to go back to just after World War II, which is about when emissions and climate emissions start spiking. So as you know, we're now at about 419, 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Back in the 40s, you're talking probably around 280, 290 something, maybe 310, 320.
Wow.
So just huge shifts in the atmosphere over the course of our agency's existence. And a lot of that comes from the shift after the war into population growth, into enormous industrialization, especially in the US, and notably into the beginning of the personal auto age. Henry Ford was mass producing Model Ts as early as the late 20s or 30s. But it's really in the transition from the 30s about into the 50s with the huge boom of Levitt towns and suburbs after the war, and with the great migration from the American South as African Americans moved north and west away from segregation. that you see enormous growth in California, enormous growth in car culture generally. This is the era when GM and its affiliates are literally buying up and taking down light rail and replacing with buses that they later close. And we begin to see people wealthy enough to own personal vehicles just everywhere in the country. So suddenly everyone has a car. And the result in Los Angeles, to everyone's surprise, is that the air becomes almost unbreathable. LA is ringed by 10 to 12,000 foot peaks. It's a dry climate. Air doesn't move a lot for much of the year, it just rains in the winter. So it draws a lot of folks in those years and becomes a major industrial center. It's also built just in time to see enormous road building under Eisenhower as the federal interstate system rolls out in the 60s. And the result, as I've said, is acid air. You know, you can't see down to the end of the block. You look at these pictures, you not only can't see the mountains, you probably can't see the skyscrapers downtown from a mile away. And this is a novel thing in the world at that time. There's been, you know, coal fog in London at about the same time that kills hundreds of people. But this is different. You know, there aren't huge coal-fired power plants here. And it takes some scientific thinking through until finally a Dutch scientist at Caltech, a guy named Arie Hagenschmidt, who becomes the first chair of the board of my organization ultimately, does a lot of atmospheric chemistry and sorts out that the oxides of nitrogen in the tailpipes from burning gasoline form smog in the air, ozone, ground level ozone, and begins to appreciate how incredibly poisonous that is. Seeking to address this problem, California founds the first of the county air districts, the first air regulators, sort of in modern times in the United States, in the South Coast Air Basin, as it comes to be called, basically LA, which begins trying to clean up cars. At each step of this, by the way, industry will say this is too expensive and will never work, and each time folks persist. By the sort of late 60s, it's become clear that cars move, which means it doesn't really work to control cars just in one county. And having had that brainwave, the state sets up the State Air Resources Board, the organization for which I now work, with the goal of setting air quality standards and vehicle manufacturing standards for all of California, as indeed California's pattern recurs. These mountain basins that trap air, this car-dependent development, also a huge problem in the vast Central Valley, 500 miles of valley against the Sierra Nevada, some of the worst air quality in the country as well. And air quality is getting worse as car-dependent sprawl continues. This is all before the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, courtesy, among others, of Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson, back in the 70s. So when the Federal Clean Air Act comes into force, one of the things it does as a result of a political compromise is carve out from what would otherwise be a national authority to set vehicle standards, a unique authority for California to continue to set vehicle emission standards on the sensible grounds that California's air is worse than anywhere else in the country, given its geography and post-war development pattern. And given CARB's already prominence in the field, having sorted out even what ozone is. So we have this really unusual fortuity, 30, 40 years ago, in which you have a state air regulator that has the power to continue using its authorities to regulate the auto industry. So there can be two standards, a federal one or a California one. And a state body that by design is out of the direct political control of the changing national politics. The way the act's set up is US EPA more or less has to grant CARB's authority to regulate, provided basically shows that it's crossed its T's and dotted its I's on its regulatory materials. And CARB itself is beyond the immediate control of its own politics, in that although its members are a mix of county electeds, gubernatorial appointees, they serve for basically indefinite terms. They're out of the immediate control of the state legislature day to day, in other words. They have a considerable degree of scientific independence. And they've staffed their agency largely with fairly hard-nosed engineers and scientists, combined with quite broad authorities. So you have this entity that, although not free of politics, nothing is unusually scientifically independent and unusually exempt from capture by its regulated parties, certainly from the auto industry. And CARB sets to work. And over the course of the 20 years or so, from 1980 to 2000, you see steady improvements in vehicle technology. And it's hard to overstate this, cuts of pollution from the tailpipe of 95%, roughly, as folks begin to, say, enclose the engine, get rid of open carburetors, make sure that you aren't just sort of venting through the crankcase or into the car. Add the catalytic converter, add a smog check program, which California still runs, where your car has to be taken off the road if it's over polluting, essentially. And by the sort of late 90s, CARB is trying to begin to innovate and require zero emission vehicles. This is pretty early in the technological development cycle, and that becomes this sort of ongoing sort of back and forth with the auto industry and the courts all through the Bush and Obama years. At about the same time as the climate crisis is getting markedly worse. So, we live on such a different planet now than we did even a decade ago or 20 years ago. And it's sort of hard to remember how in the future the climate crisis probably seemed even then. Obviously, there were warnings as early as the Johnson administration, but you start seeing real political churn on this in the 90s under Clinton, but not a lot of direct action. And 8 years of delay and misdirection under W. Bush. And all through this time, however, California continues trying to push quite hard on setting up systems that can address the climate crisis, including what remains the US's primary cap and trade system. So an economy-wide system that caps carbon and causes it to decline in California. Polluters can trade pollution allowances under that cap to find the most economically efficient way of reducing pollution that continues to decline. Those revenues from that system go back into the state and are reinvested, including in R&D and in vehicle research and controls, quite notably, and these revenues are in the billions. A low carbon fuel standard that requires the carbon content of fuel to begin to decline. So you begin to get substitutes to gasoline, initially biofuels and increasingly electricity. A renewable portfolio standard that requires all of California's electricity to come from renewable sources. And increasingly stringent auto standards, including our first ZEV mandate, zero emission vehicle, that requires autos fleets to reach on the order of about 12% zero emission vehicles by the mid 2020s. This is the state of affairs. At about the time, there's one other contingency of note happens, and then I'll sort of zoom through Trump and talk about where we are in the present. I just want you to note this sort of interesting, steady political progress, largely technological, often buffeted by national winds. You can imagine how the Bush administration felt about our programs, but nonetheless driving forward. And then there's sort of a big break, which is that as our criteria pollutant, as we call them, our smog pollutant standards get more stringent, it's becoming ever harder for diesel cars to comply. And Volkswagen one day announces that it nonetheless has a diesel system that can, and starts very heavily selling what it calls clean diesel vehicles, which turn out some years later to be absolutely cheating. They have got a little system inside that turns off the emission controls whenever it's driving on the road. So it looks clean on the little test dynamometer on which we test the cars, but then immediately turns it off again. So pollution, 10 times greater. We catch them. VW has ships full of cars sitting at the port of Long Beach. We won't let them unload. They confess. And next thing you know, VW's corporate executives are going to jail, and VW, the largest automaker in the world, has agreed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to mitigate its crime, and notably to fund nationwide electric vehicle charging systems as a condition of that settlement. Not too long after, VW decides, as a matter of corporate strategy, that's getting out of internal combustion entirely. And this is a really important hinge moment. It's again, not inevitable. It's a system that's been set up that perhaps makes it more likely, this vigilant regulator, these declining standards. But suddenly you have a big shift in the industry, a shift so notable that in the Trump years, as Trump tries to more or less blow up the entire regulatory system, you have not just the usual state and nonprofit resistance, of which there's a lot. CARB files under my direction and our team, like 50 different lawsuits against the Trump administration, winning most of them to sort of slow down the rollback. You have a major shift in the industry's own regulatory direction. So you start seeing, Ford and Honda, Volvo, others committing to move to zero emission vehicles regardless of political direction. And by the end of the Trump years, even as Trump attempts to rescind one of our waivers for this very program I'm talking about under the Clean Air Act, you see multiple global automakers decide to contract with California to agree to carry on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from their vehicles, regardless of what federal law might require. well above any floor, which really speaks both to the possibility of restoring CARB's authority, which Joe Biden in fact does, but to this point, the industrial policy shift that's been generated in the industry, where once Biden becomes president, spreads. So there's now at this point really not an auto company that hasn't committed to exiting internal combustion, either almost wholly or completely, by as early as the late 2020s or as late as the 2030s. And that's really quite extraordinary. There are a lot of reasons for this, and I'll sort of turn now, and it's where we stand now. So where do we stand? At this point, out of this fortuity in history, we have a system in which the industry itself is now acquiring a great deal of momentum, not just for cars, but now for trucks and off-road vehicles, into zero emission. There are quite good reasons for this. Some of them perhaps are self-serving. For instance, it takes notably less labor to make a ZEV vehicle than an internal combustion engine. Think of the difference of installing a battery in your laptop or phone versus the endless series of tubes and valves and devices an internal combustion engine might take. Some of this is because the product's better. Zero emission vehicles tend to last, we think, 2 to 4 times longer than internal combustion engines, which makes sense if you think about it. A car, you're basically blowing up tiny explosions in the engine 24/7, coating its valves with gunk. And a battery vehicle, you're more or less just sort of plugging it in, has almost no moving parts. They cost less to run, so they're attractive to consumers. They accelerate faster. They're capable, as Ford realized when it released the F-150 Lightning, of powering your house for days during power interruption or an emergency, whether it be a storm or a fire. They're quite a different sort of thing. And we're beginning to see this sort of titanic shift as a result, in part now still guided by law, but increasingly being driven by market power as well. So at this point, what we are seeing at CARB is a shift in California where from just, 5-10% of the market, less 2%, decade or so ago, zero emission vehicles are now at 16.5% of new vehicle sales as of this quarter, up from 12% last year, up from 8% the year before that, in the light duty market. In states outside of California, states are able to choose to adopt our standards if they so choose, which many states in the Northeast have done, as has Minnesota, but not for reasons best known to it, Wisconsin. We similarly see vastly increasing sales percentages of these vehicles, which is quite encouraging. The laws we have passed and the budgets we have signed will continue this progress. So let me give you a picture of those and then talk about some of the complexities and government challenges, and then we can move on to the more interesting part of discussion. The suite of laws we've passed are really pretty exceptional in vehicle space. As of this August, the board voted unanimously to take sales all the way to 100% of zero emission vehicles by law by 2035. That rule includes provisions on environmental justice and equity, essentially giving extra credit for vehicles sold in lower income areas or communities of color, or for more inexpensively. It also includes the world's first standards for battery durability and warranty and repairability, which both allows us to avoid using as much heavy, critical earth minerals and others. Battery components, make sure they're recyclable, and also ensures the vehicles can last in the used vehicle markets where most people actually buy cars. The board will be considering in a few weeks a parallel rule called Advanced Clean Fleets that will turn over much of the freight system, which has obviously been so polluting, especially during the pandemic, because everyone ordered online, to zero emission trucks in advance of overall deadlines, so new and existing trucks, and set a sales end date for heavy duty vehicles using internal combustion of 2040, although we're been asked to bring that forward into the 2030s, and the board will consider that. We have similar rules for seemingly more esoteric sources, like the refrigeration units you see on trucks, which turn out to absolutely blast communities around warehouses, say in Southeast Wisconsin, with diesel pollution, taking all those to zero instead. Rules for forklifts being considered in the spring, which again might not sound like a lot, but turns out there are tens of thousands of the things and they're pretty easy to plug in. And rules to help our federal colleagues along. For instance, the Advanced Clean Fleet rule requires all delivery fleets to go to 100% electric. So although Trump's postmaster, Louis DeJoy, who continues the Postal Service, had not wanted to electrify the Postal Service fleet, even though those things are totally good candidates for it. They're centrally charged, they're in your neighborhood. If you operate in California, you have to take that part of the fleet to 100% zero emission as well, as we've pointed out to them under our rules. We've also paired this with a large scale shift in funding. Both the cap and trade system, which funds so many of our efforts, and the low carbon fuel standard, which also generates revenues, and the overall state general fund. As I've said, this year's California budget dedicates around $54 billion to various forms of climate priorities, 10 billion of which is in my sphere on vehicles and in vehicle charging infrastructure. And now, courtesy of the bipartisan infrastructure package and the Inflation Reduction Act, there are billions more flowing nationally. Notably aimed not just at buying down the purchase price of vehicles, but at extending the fueling system, at retrofitting factories, at helping communities transition away from fossil fuel dependency, which is really critical. So think about, say, Appalachia or the oil patch, and how do we make sure folks have pensions, have jobs, even as the system as a whole shifts. So, and also many, many millions of dollars in research and development and onshoring our supply chain, so we're less dependent on other nations for this manufacture, which is already bearing considerable fruit. We've seen, even since the passage of the federal bill, many new announcements of factories and sort of North American efforts. So where does this leave us? I think this is a fascinating set of puzzles. At its core, it leaves us at the end of a historical period, right? It's been about a century since internal combustion really began to dominate in the 20s, and less than that since the huge explosion in internal combustion vehicles after the war. And we now see an end to that, which I think this became so much the furniture of our day to day. There's always a gas station on the corner. Everyone's used to driving their car and filling up the tank. That takes a little bit of getting used to, but is true. This is now a defunct technology, not so different than the transition from horse and buggy a century past, the timing of which and the scale of change is novel. This is the first time that we've really chosen the sort of technological transition, driven in part by global crisis, in part by possibility, and in part by the truly wild fortuity that California's state regulator happened to be focused here because LA's air quality is pretty terrible. We're at a point where we've made huge progress. You can see the mountains in LA now, but they're steadily less snow-capped because of climate change. And where we have real peril, right? Where every year, wildfires get worse, storms get worse. So we're in a bit of a race between industrialization and new industrialization in the climate crisis. And a time of larger sort of ramifying dislocations. For instance, it really is important that much of our infrastructure is currently funded off gas taxes. So as we move away from gas, there'll be huge questions about how we finance local government, state government. Do we shift into roadway charges? It is, for instance, pretty weird that the enormous road systems free of charge to encourage driving, which is quite socially destructive, but from car accidents through to air pollution. Do we find other sorts of financing mechanisms? How do we think about retirements and community protection, not just for oil field workers who will begin to attrit out, but we want to make sure folks have their pensions and healthcare, but also for communities in which this is a major part of the tax base. How do we think about economic diversification? What do you do with all these corner gas stations, each one of which probably has a leaking fuel tank and is somewhat contaminated land around it, and therefore has real liability problems, but also are now thousands upon thousands of valuable urban and rural corner lots during what is an increasingly national housing crisis. There are interesting possibilities that weren't visible before that we just really need to think through. How do we think about new supply chains, new mineral availability? For instance, California is likely to mine the Salton Sea, but there are also efforts at hard rock mining, including some, for instance, near the boundary waters in Minnesota or in tribal lands in Nevada that have real equity questions to them that require working through. And more ultimately, how do we ultimately shift our landscape? One of the things that has been really true of the auto era is that it's been in many ways bad for us. Not only have folks been, and the ways it's been bad for us won't be wholly remediated by shifting away from internal combustion. Zero emission vehicles are quite different, but they are still cars. So you have the problem that cars don't fit well in cities. So many of our urban centers have been torn up by parking lots, have been divided by highways. As we all know, the highway system was largely rammed through Black and brown communities. Look at Madison, right? Many of its roads pass through areas that were immigrant communities that are now under highways or have otherwise been torn down or partially redeveloped. You have major dislocations that are beginning to be repaired. There are dollars in California and the federal bills for taking out urban highways, for getting people back into the streets for transit. And that matters. So the one question is, as we move into this era, we'll have millions of old internal combustion vehicles. We don't necessarily just want to swap each one of those for a ZEV. So how do we make other alternatives more attractive? How do we get to a point where we can imagine not just good battery technology, but apartments and buses, good transit, vibrant communities, a world in which we have, one hopes, durable social networks, including for those affected by the transition to this new technological world, but durable communities that don't require you to buy a depreciating and deadly asset to get around. So your personal mobility is still maintained, but it's also possible to walk down to the corner store. So this gets into development patterns, into zoning, and how do we've sort of exploded our cities into component parts as cars became popular, and how we begin to pull that back together. And how do we do all this under the threat of climate change? A system-wide threat that's already significantly straining our social fabric, that gives voice in some ways to anti-immigrant hysterias, to worries about global migrations, and that challenges the state, the state in all sorts of ways, from budget, as we have, say, multi-billion dollars in Florida, as we've just seen, to fires in California. So these are multiple systems changing at once, which I suppose has always been true, but is just acutely true. So it's a challenge to the capacity of states, to how we think about communities. It's just much bigger than just changing out the engine in the car. That's one part of this larger story that's combined. And I guess I'll close by saying it is remarkable in some ways, both how short and how sweeping this history is. On the one hand, we've seen the very components of the global atmosphere change under the weight of automobility in less than a century. We found ourselves in a crisis of our own making, just based solely upon all these various individual and state and government and corporate choices. We're now beginning to get out of it, but it's not been that long. Not long ago, I was at the River Rouge, Ford's manufacturing facility outside Detroit. And all the stories of that era are there. The vastly populated city of Detroit, pulled apart by highway development, declining hours of unions. And there's Ford's facility, still unionized, and they've just torn down the old historic Ford factory that built the Model T and replaced it with an enormous robotic facility that's now building their Lightnings, their electric pickup trucks.
Wow.
That are rolling off the line on the same foundations. And it's one of those extraordinary moments. Yeah, exactly. Where you sort of see the landscape shifting. You're at the very center of automobility. There's the giant tire that welcomes you to Detroit on the side of the road. They're the enormous towers of the remaining auto barons. And they're in that landscape. You see this sort of emerging change. So it's a really extraordinary moment. And I think that covers a bit of what I'm seeing. And I'm happy to spend the next half hour chatting with you all about anything you want to chat about.
Wow, that is really, what a super summary of all of that. I really, really, really appreciate all that. Now, just from a process point here, Dennis, I don't, with my little phone sitting here in Charlotte in a library parking lot, I can't see the chats. So there may be questions people have that you might want to do, but I've got some that I'll start with if you want me to.
That sounds good, Terry.
So one of the things I think is really clever or interesting about this, the new ruling, is that you went at car makers, not car buyers.
That's right. Yeah. That's so. And generally speaking, and this varies. We do have some roles, especially in the heavy duty space, where we require fleets to turn over. But those are folks with big capital. This is Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the big warehouse owners. For individual people, a car is probably the second biggest financial decision they make, after your housing choices and sometimes after your healthcare. And it really doesn't work to require most people to retire their car early or to sell their vehicle for all sorts of reasons. And you see this financial system. I mean, in many ways, the car industry is a car loan industry. They're financialized.
Oh, sure.
And so you need to get at the big sources of private capital, which are the corporations themselves. And that's been, I will say, an interesting moment. It used to be, you sort of think about the larger capital arrangements here. There are only a few entities capitalized enough to both have real political power, to be able to lobby state governments, national governments, and to invest substantially in change. And for instance, and that's often the oil industry, which fuels so much of the economy, the utility industry, which has regulated monopolies and enormous power, and the auto industry, among others. And for the longest time, the auto industry was allied with oil, which is one reason we've seen so little climate progress. And it's been an interesting change to see the auto industry ally itself with utilities and electricity, much to the chagrin of oil. So as that capital shifts, as they get pushed by regulators, but also make their own board choices, and at this point, the boards have to think that way, right? This is not just California now, it's China and Canada and the EU, and now the national US government. That alliance has shifted, where now the natural allies of the autos are utilities and power. And those capital pools are enough to really drive large scale change. I see GM and Ford building out chargers, of their own volition all across the country. And that's interesting. And you see the oil industry increasingly chagrined.
Well, I think it's fascinating a way approach to how to get this thing done. There's been a lot of talk with the hurricane and some Facebook memes that showed like an electric vehicle melting, fire department around it. You've got all the folks saying, "Oh yeah, you're sitting in the line for 7 hours to escape," and what's going to happen? What do you say to those things?
There's several things. I mean, first, it's worth noting the electric vehicles really perform differently than internal combustion vehicles. But let me begin with the sort of disasters here. It's true that we have, a just much less stable world we're living in. So mobility is important for all sorts of reasons. It's really important we stop making the world so unstable. So, the last thing you want to do is keep digging the emissions hole. But it's important day to day that your vehicle be reliable. So part of obviously what we've regulated is, warranty and durability for all those reasons on the battery. But on the charging network, these cars stay charged, and they have ranges now of, 150, 200, 300 miles. So it's not different than your gas car. And it's not like you need to stop and plug it in or have an extension cord running behind you as you flee the fire. So it's really the same thing as your ordinary vehicle, but with the benefit that they can stabilize grids and your home, notably. So let's say there's a blackout. First of all, in a disaster, you need power to run gas pumps. So it's not really a different problem for folks who may or may not have filled up their gas tank recently. But the difference, of course, is you can fuel an electric vehicle almost anywhere. You can only fuel a gas vehicle at the gas station, hence those hours-long lines. During blackouts, EVs can also stabilize the grid. So, for instance, California just went through, as a result of climate change, its highest power demand in its history. I think it was like 52,000 megawatt hours, higher than we'd ever seen. And we were largely saved from blackouts, unlike Texas, which notably hasn't invested in this, by these technological shifts. So we've put online in the last 5 years enormous stationary battery capacity that we've been replacing gas-fired and coal-fired power plants with, which is the same technology that the cars are making cheaper. So this is a virtuous upward cycle that is larger in scale than many of our nuclear-fired power plants were. And it was those discharging batteries that largely stabilized the grid. So it's a different world. And the same is true of vehicles. You can tell cars when to charge. They don't have to charge at peak. And you can also tell them when to discharge. So what you've functionally done with EVs, and this will be increasingly true, is created a decentralized power grid and power storage system that you can deploy or not deploy, whether it's your individual house. As I say, the Lightning can probably power a house for a couple of days, or in the context of millions now of moving batteries, the system. So it's not, so there tends to be this sort of Facebook memification where, the power grid is, maybe challenged by climate change demand. The last thing you want to do is have an electric car, but sort of, first level gotcha thinking. It's not really how it works.
Yeah, I got you with that. These are some of the folks on Facebook that I keep in touch with, just so I figure out.
It's a great chance to find out how people have thought about things for 5 seconds.
What the other part of the brain is.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that is one of the things, and then Dennis, I'll turn it over to you for that, but I still have lots of other questions. But for you personally, Craig, you were one of the top lawyers for the Sierra Club. And you just talked about what could be happening up in Tamarack, Minnesota, with the nickel mines and the Boundary Waters, where I think you've probably been. I know I've been many, many times. How do you balance that? Is it we just have to move ahead so quickly to prevent this? I mean, how do you balance it in your head, knowing what you're doing, but also how much you did for Sierra Club to protect things like Tamarack?
Well, I mean, I think we have a lot of challenges ahead. I think a lot of about a work called anti-resilience. So, in other words, not returning to the way things are, by Shalonda Baker, who grew up not in the boundary waters, but in Louisiana and Texas, and talking about just the many, many communities who are just totally undone by oil and gas. I'm trying to think about a transition that doesn't sacrifice new folks, but also begins to undo, the sacrifice zones, which of course track race and power. Um, from the oil industry. And I do think we don't want to replicate that story. So there are things we all can and should do. I think it's generally wrong to think that the only answer is just full speed ahead and let's plow under more of the world. It's true we're in a crisis, so there's perhaps some balance there, but I think there's quite a lot we can do. As if, for instance, a great deal, we're constantly seeing the battery chemistry is reformulated to reduce demand. You can push that. This regulation does. There are better and worse ways to mine. For instance, there's solution mining, where you're basically dissolving minerals underground, bringing them up and extracting them, which, for instance, in California, that underground sort of water process is already happening at geothermal plants, where folks are injecting water to turn into steam in the volcanoes around the Salton Basin. Well, that water is already full of lithium when it comes back up. And GM's just in major contracts, or is in the process of contracting to buy a lot of that lithium. So there are all these different iterations of this. What's going on in the boundary waters is obviously really worrying. They don't have enough to know about that particular mine in detail. But I would say, I think it really requires continued, really deep community involvement. On the one hand, we're seeing a shift toward really trying to build things. One reason we finally got climate policy passed federally was really building out new things. We've got to build a new power grid. We have to build new factories. In some ways, this is really positive. You're reopening the facilities in places like Janesville, that have sort of been hurting. That's great. But you're also industrializing areas that haven't been industrialized. I don't think there's a magic answer to that, but it requires, there was this push after the climate bill passed to then just sort of waive all federal permitting that died in the Senate that Joe Manchin had wanted. I don't disagree that we need faster permitting of some things. It's crazy that it takes us 20 years to build a rail line or a power grid. But when you're talking about major facilities that could poison folks, I mean, it's appropriate to have the community involved and able to litigate and think about it.
Yeah. Dennis, you want to take some?
Sure. One question that came in kind of early in the discussion is to ask about hydrogen and sort of technologies that seem to be on the horizon and are developing. Hydrogen, fuel cell, how do you see that playing in here?
Fuel cell is fascinating. So all of our regulations can be complied with fuel cell or battery, first of all, and we funded both technologies. In part, the answer here is when we want to make a bet, given the scale of the crisis, and just one path right now. So how this works for folks who may be less aware is hydrogen can in principle be combusted, but it can also be used in fuel cells to generate electricity, essentially through the reverse process of electrolysis of water to power vehicles. Has some advantages. Hydrogen is just sitting around, so it's basically an energy transfer medium. You can make it from fossil fuels. You can also make it by electrolyzing water with renewable power. It's also a byproduct of refineries. So hydrogen's been of interest, obviously, to the fossil fuel industry. It's a way to continue selling some of their products in lower carbon forms, potentially, although how you make it really matters. Advantages for vehicles, I mean, it's very energy dense. So in contexts where it might take a while to charge a vehicle, although that obviously can vary based on battery chemistry, you can move heavy vehicles perhaps further and faster, less fueling time. Disadvantage, you have to build a hydrogen fueling network, right? So, you're putting up fueling stations, that's pipes, that's tanking. On the other hand, or the other hand, kind of an octopus problem, I guess, you do have a lot of pipes from the natural gas industry that may no longer be used. So perhaps that's a path there. So it's at this stage in maximally fraught possibility territory. We're seeing real interest in fuel cell vehicles, especially in heavy duty, which is quite interesting. We're seeing some light duty hydrogen. Toyota has been a big investor there, for instance, and a lot of the Japanese companies. That's right now a smaller percentage of the light duty vehicle market. But it's hard to know what happens in the 2030s. It's possible that this really takes off. It's possible it doesn't. Really important to think about its carbon content either way. So for instance, we track the life cycle carbon content of all fuels to sort of deal with this issue. But where it goes is little hard to predict, but as I say, one wants to hedge one's bets and it has a different set of advantages. You are dependent on lithium. No one needs to mine, the boundary waters. On the other hand, maybe you're running some of the old refineries that have been poisoning communities in Louisiana a lot longer. So, none of this is free and all of it's pretty complex.
Regarding the issue of charging, you want to talk a little bit about maybe the mix of your approaches, regulatory as well as incentive, in making sure that there are enough charging stations? Are you requiring parking lots, for example, to have stalls with charging stations, incentives for companies, universities?
Yeah, it's a bunch of different fronts, and I think it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. So the first round of this was, as they say, co-opting some of Volkswagen's money and then increasingly building out state systems where utilities are rewarded with putting in charging, which of course they want to do. So they can build that into the rate structures. And a lot of just direct public grants and funding, some competitive, some not, generally mapped carefully. So we make sure we're covering everyone, not just the market, the pieces the market will take up. So you want to get in places, tribal lands, rural lands, the market might be slow to, so you have a real network. All 50 states now have charging plans approved through the federal government, all of which kind of look like this. And you also can do things as you noted, Dennis, on building codes and zoning. So California, for instance, requires most new construction to provide charging and to be charging ready, actually to be all electric ready. So, and this isn't quite everywhere as complicated, but this is where it's going. So in other words, not only can your building charge your car, but it can power your electric stove or heater, since that thing's just putting out internal fumes all the time. And you want to get off that too. Those sorts of thinking about the built infrastructure really matters, because ultimately, if you think about where we are, there will be an overbuilt fossil infrastructure. As you have fewer and fewer gas cars, you can't sustain all the refineries, you can't sustain all the gas stations. Similar, as you get away from natural gas, you have this huge gas grid that you don't want to maintain. So part of this is thinking through the utility and planning structure. So you're increasingly shifting things into electric, and then beginning to deal with the stuff that you haven't thought of, the zoning code restrictions or local permitting to make it happen fast. And then finally, you're starting to see really interesting private investment, right? I mean, it's hugely in the auto's interest to fund this sort of thing. So, GM, Tesla, others building their own networks, but also new entrants. For instance, Starbucks has started partnering with charging companies because they figured out that if it takes you 20 minutes to charge a car, you're going to want to get a coffee. And so suddenly you have thousands of Starbucks that for not much money can put in charging stations, have another revenue line and be fine. Or for, say, apartment dwellers, seeing more and more companies figure out that if you offer the apartment building owner, a cut of, small cut of the charging revenue, she's probably more than happy to have you retrofit their building, put it on, just as we've seen people do with solar panels. So I think what we're really driving for here, as with everything else, is not to have the public fisc just fund this forever, but to get enough of it set up and then to watch people go, oh, actually. And then you start seeing interesting dynamics, whether it's, as I say, coffee shops or landlords or anywhere else, to start moving it forward more quickly.
Mm-hmm. What about the issue of compatibility? One of the most visible issues is Tesla having,
Yes.
Sort of not allowing non-Tesla cars to get charged on its charging station.
Yeah, that's a classic regulator problem. So we've required them all now to standardize their charging inlets and outlets, and to provide adapters to any new buyers. So once these rules are in place, they've got to give you a really long charging cord, and they've got to give you an adapter connection so you can use anybody's chargers. The one thing that no one's required yet is for Tesla to open its network. I think that probably happens, whether commercially or by law eventually, because it's just such an obvious asset. Could happen. Right now, we focus more on rules that standardize reliability of chargers and that also ensure everyone can pay. For instance, a lot of the shiny new tech companies think you can all just sort of pay with their special apps, which really doesn't work for a lot of people. You might not even have data on your phone. So we've been requiring them to accept more standard credit cards and charge cards and so on, and are starting to think about how you pay if you're unbanked. Do you use Cash App or what? Because you can't just go into the attendant and pay with cash. So trying to create those systems that private people might not think about, but to make sure that there's broader access.
Sure. And what about charging stations in rural areas and along the interstates and state highways?
Yeah, that's been a huge focus for us and is now a focus for the federal government too. There's a program So for California, we map out demand and distance from charging station along all the corridors and have been building structurally along those, as well as in tribal nations where we've been putting actually really specific focus. We're doing, I think later this year, a solicitation to tribal governments to help fund charging stations across California. Nationally, one of the programs in the bipartisan bill that passed last year was called NEVI, which is, I think, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan. Each state, including Wisconsin, submitted one of those in exchange for lots of federal grant dollars. And that's very explicitly focused on coverage. So in other words, one of the first things the federal system probably funds are charging along the federal highways, which will help in rural areas. That's not a complete answer. And part of that, I think, is sort of another government role. But we will see, I think, within the next 2 or 3 years, because these things actually aren't that hard to install, they're plugs, a national system that is good enough to get people around most states in the country. It won't have comprehensive coverage. I mean, say you're up in northern Wisconsin or something, it's probably behind and requires state investment, but you will see a federal backbone.
Dennis, we have, I think Evers announced $78 million in our budget. I mean, we got $78 million federal from the climate energy package that Biden signed. And I think that's obviously where a lot of that goes. I'm curious how it'll happen, when you've got your Esso station, your British Petroleum. Well, your electricity looks about the same to me. We're not going to have when I was growing up in Nashville, they said their gas was their air in their tire. You get the air, pink air. Come to Spur and get pink air in your tires.
Oh, sounds fancy.
But what's going to happen with those kind of dealers? If electricity is electricity, and that's what you say, aligning with utilities, I only want to go to an MG&E charging station, not a PG. And it's just curious to see how it's all going to work out.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There'll be all these sort of different business models, and people might be able to, differentiate on maybe convenience or reliability, and you can differentiate a little bit on price, but ultimately I think it's going to be a pretty different world. I will say, a lot of those little gas stations are really convenience stores. Obviously, they want you to buy the cheese curds at the counter, and so gas is a loss leader for a lot of them. So some of those guys are still going to be around. And maybe they'll have some chargers and hope you linger, but they may need to put in a coffee shop or something to get you to sit around for 10 minutes and see what else you want to buy.
And this, Dennis, also like what you're saying about Tesla, the car dealers, Tesla sells directly. What is Cadillac? What's Chevy? What's going to have those dealers if they don't want to switch over to selling electric vehicles, another opportunity for disruption, perhaps a good disruption.
Yeah, the dealer system's really interesting, right? Because it's originally intended in principle to protect consumer choice and stop direct pricing, but can also create its own weird monopoly. So there's this whole consumer protection and design question around dealers and franchises. I will say that for many years, dealers either didn't know how or didn't want to sell electric cars often. You get talked out of it a lot. That's really shifted. I mean, one thing that really has struck me, I'll give you an example. As I've said, states can choose to opt into our system. Virginia, under its last governor, a Democrat, had decided to do so and put in law a requirement that they just follow California's standards, whatever they are, which means Virginia is actually the second state. New York signed on last week to go to 100% electric, much to the chagrin of its current Republican governor. And he's now trying to repeal this law. He's stymied. There's a Democratic state Senate there. But incredibly, the Virginia car dealers are actually are opposing repeal. It's a complete night and day thing. Dealers were suing us, 15 years ago to stop EVs, but now the dealer association thinks this is the better product. They want into the system so they get their share of vehicles from the makers, and they really want to sell. And I hear from all the car companies demanding, the dealers are demanding trainings. They want on-site charging so they can charge vehicles for people. And you also see other interesting dynamics. I mean, last week, Hertz inked a deal to buy, I think, 150,000 EVs, I want to say, from GM. I mean, it's a different thing. So watching those demands shift sort of speaks to how seismic this is. And no longer is your dealer trying to get you into, a gas guzzler, but probably wants to sell you a Mustang EV instead. I mean, would still be delighted for you to spend as much money as possible, but it's somewhat different goals.
A related question to the issue of electricity and the grid. And that is, is California concerned about the cryptocurrency mining and the amount of power that takes? There's also the issue of noise, but apparently it really drains a lot of electricity from the grid.
Yeah, it's hard to see that as anything other than a fraud. So yes, it's not my direct area, but the idea of a currency backed by no government with no savings protection that also draws a lot of power just seems sort of self-evidently bad. We functionally, we don't regulate power demand at CARB. We do require that all power be renewably generated across the system. Well, California does, and CARB has a role in that. So functions crypto demand inches up here is at least covered by cleaner sources. But data centers, this is a different topic, the power there in general, often have diesel generators behind them. So this is another area where the sorts of battery tech that cars are pioneering may quietly also clean up the internet. We've begun seeing them shift to batteries as batteries become more politic. So indirectly, I guess crypto's cleaner as a result of this, but I don't know why anyone wants crypto anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah, another related issue, which we're going to be talking about later on in our sessions at PLATO. Question regarding, I guess, federalism generally and the role of states, and particularly California, which, because of its size, because of the market, is really able to be a model and also to exert pressure on the rest of the country to, the famous issue with some of the pollution, anti-pollution devices. But the other concern that's emerging now is with our Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, and rulings that it's had regarding the Environmental Protection Agency and the kind of curtailing some of the authority of the EPA. Do you see this as a potential threat to California? How are you anticipating the role of California in the federal system?
Sure. So, obviously California's role is set up and blessed by the courts for many years in Congress. It's this idea of iterative federalism, that goes back to, say, Louis Brandeis, right? States as laboratories of democracy, states that can try new things. And it's been a really successful public benefit. Obviously, the current court is hostile to all forms of regulation, and there's lawsuits, always against us on these authorities and against EPA, and it's always a danger. The court's majority is, I think, fundamentally illegitimate, right? Appointed by unelected, by the popular vote presidents, more or less beholden to the Republican Party's political agenda. It's a threat, I guess is what I'd say. In general here, technological progress is such that I don't think the court can ultimately stop this transition, but they've certainly been friendly to oil interests.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You want to talk a little bit more about the politics? Who's pushing back on what you're doing, and how successful are they from time to time?
Yeah, not very, but more in the past. Ultimately, this is about a conflict, as I've sort of said, between fossil interests and non-fossil interests, and that really is the largest source of pushback. There are legitimate implementation and design issues that you'd expect, individual owners and companies, how's this going to work, that are more sort of in the ordinary course. Local governments trying to think through these changes. But the source of just sort of monolithic opposition is very much the oil industry. It's interesting, I should know that California is a heavily oil producing state. It is really sort of remarkable. We produce, I think we're the third after Alaska and Texas. And so it's a sort of remarkable fortuity that our air quality problems are bad enough and our regulator independent enough that we've continued on a course that functionally is now really shifting away from that industry's product. So there's a lot of conversation in California around how we handle this transition in a just way and how we do it, but they've lost a lot of political mojo. And I think the reason for that is it's really for the first time there's been a viable substitute to their product, right? It's, we've planned so poorly, we have so many car dependent areas that for a long time they functionally had a political and product monopoly. And that's no longer true. And it turns out that politically people don't actually like paying for gas. And so, once there's an alternative, a lot of that force becomes weaker. They still employ a lot of people, but they employ fewer people than the renewable energy industry. and in the same way that coal has fewer employees than Burger King. So things are different than they were. And they don't actually have a very attractive product. It poisons people and it's expensive.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
Wow. Well,
Um,
we're going to probably have to let you go here. I really appreciate you taking all of this time. I know
Sure.
you got an amazing job, an amazing responsibility of things going on, but this has just been fascinating. I think, particularly this stuff about justice. I'm really intrigued with the justice issues you bring up about the valuable corners that gas stations have, and is there a spot perhaps for homeless? I mean, there's so many things about this dislocation, disruption that I'm really, really intrigued by the justice piece of this. I don't know about you, Dennis, what you think.
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for having me. And I agree. I think this is one of those moments when we got a chance to get a major industrial change more right. Really appreciate everyone's interactions into the chat. So thanks, Bill, in the chat there, and talk to you all later. Feel free to drop me a line with any questions.
Okay.
And good luck with fatherhood.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. You'll enjoy, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right.
See, it seems fun and straightforward. Talk to you all. Bye.
Okay. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
I'm good. Dennis, it's of course, the irony is not lost to me that I'm sitting in a car while we talk about all of this.
Right.
But I am going to cut out of here now. I'm not sure what you wanted with the rest of the classes is, but I'll be in touch with everybody and we'll figure out where we're going. Okay.
Okay. And do you want to say something about next week?
Well, next week we're sort of still up in the air on it right now. I've got a guy named Tom Ricemussel who is involved deeply in what all the new alternative foods are, alternative meats, alternative eggs, what's going on with the food production industry. And that's the one we have right now. I know you have Mark Pocan for sure on the 25th. And
Right.
we also, I'm sorry, that's so that 11th is next week. The 18th, we have Shay Stedman from the fire department talking about CARES, which is the program the Madison police run that is opposite. Rather than send cops out when there are mental health issues, this is when they send out social workers and and people who will be helpful more than people with guns. October 25th, we have the future of banking and also Mark Pocan. And November 1st, we have Christian Overlord with the Wisconsin Historical Society. So that's where we are right now. And I still have a few things out, and I'm hoping to nail some others down.
Okay.
So the 25th is a double, right? Is that
correct?
Yeah.
The 25th is
yeah. Mark Pocan will start at 11. So we'll have 2 hours on the 25th.
Right.
So, okay.
So that's where we stand right now. And I'll be working on the rest of that, the 11th and the one after the election in the next couple of days. So that's where we stand. I've got several calls out and several checking in with healthcare with Mark Graffentine. I've got something with homelessness with Justin Costanato from the Community Commonwealth. So I've got the future of cities with the League of Women Voters. I'm sorry, the League of Municipalities with Kurt Watinsky. So I've got several of these that are hanging, and I'm just trying to nail down as they respond to me.
Good. Well, we appreciate all the work that you're doing on this.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Terry.
I'm going to cut out, and you can keep talking with folks. And it's a beautiful day in North Carolina. Bye-bye.
Well, it's a beautiful day here too. So I think that does it for today. Unless anybody's got a question that they'd like to ask as we sign off here. But okay, well, yeah, get out and enjoy the weather while we can. Unfortunately, it's that time of the year where every time it's a nice day, we always have to have that caveat of, yeah, but we know what's coming.
Thanks, Dennis. It was a great session today. Loved it.
Good. Well, thank you. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yep. Bye now.